hello, welcome to the show. Welcome to Not Just Nintendo, a video game podcast that is primarily about Nintendo, but it's not just Nintendo. This is, of course, episode 2, the second episode, if you don't count the little introductory episode 0 pilot episode thing, which, I mean, I wouldn't probably count that. And I guess I'm the dictator around here. If I don't count it, it don't count. Uh, so, anyways, welcome. Welcome to the show. I already said that. Hello, hello. Of course, I've got a bit of a story for you guys. I started hosting this show. I put out the episode 0 episode while hosting through RSS. I don't know what that stands for, but that's the platform I was using. And, the podcast, it's in an RSS feed. So, like, RSS must be, like, the main thing. I don't know. But anyways, I was hosting through RSS, and I put out one episode, and I tried to put out the next one. I tried to put out episode 1, and RSS was like, nope, you gotta pay. And I was like, what? Apparently you only get one free episode. And I'm like, well, screw you, RSS. I'm gonna go elsewhere. So I went to Podbean, because I was like, that one's free, right? So I went to Podbean. I put out the next episode, and then all of a sudden it came up and it was like 3 hours left this month. I was like, oh god, that's not gonna work. So apparently the free plan only has like 5 hours a month or something. I was like, yeah, that's gonna be really pushing it because there's gonna be weeks where we have 5 episodes or months where we have 5 episodes, right? Because it's weekly, and some months have 5 Wednesdays, right? And I was like, well, that's not gonna work because the episodes are like an hour and a half. Even 4 a month probably wouldn't quite work. So I was like, well, that's not gonna work. So I had to move the podcast a third time. This time to Spotify. And so I'm now hosting with Spotify for podcasters, or I think it's actually Spotify for creators now. I don't know, it's kind of weird. But anyways, I'm hosting over there now, which is better in some ways, but it also means that I'm now having difficulty trying to move every platform that the show was on before so that the host is Spotify. Because for some places, it says that it's still using the RSS host. Other places say they're not. But I can't unattach the RSS host without like subscribing to RSS, which is like the stupidest thing in the history of the world, probably. And there's been a lot of stupid things. I mean, I'm here, right? So, anyways, enough blabbering. You guys, a lot of you probably don't even know what I'm talking about. But it means that I'm trying to get the show back in some places where it was before, and it is now no longer. And it's been a bit of a mess. But I know for sure, 100%, it is on YouTube, it is on Spotify. I guess those are really the only two I can say for sure for certain. But I think it's on some other places too. It's just it's a little hard to figure it out. I think it's on iHeartRadio, but they're being a little weird. I know Amazon Prime wasn't wanting to work properly, so we'll see. It's certainly not on Apple. That's the one I know for sure. It's not on Apple. So I'm still trying to figure out some of that stuff. I know I got a request for Bungu. I don't even know what that is, to be honest with you. I don't know if that's a real thing. I guess I can look it up right now. Is Bungu a real place? I don't think so. Bungu podcast. I know that it was Cameron who suggested that, and if you are somebody from the YouTube channel, then you might recognize Cameron as a bit of a prankster. So I don't know what that is. Oh, anyways, I hope I didn't just say something really weird. Doesn't matter. Okay, so enough blabbering. It's been 4 minutes. We've said nothing. I'm a terrible podcaster. That's just, it's just the fact. It's still episode 2. All right, give me some time to get with it. So if you didn't watch last show, then you probably should because we're at a point right now where it's not hard to catch up on the entire backlog because there's only 2 episodes, right? So later on when there's hundreds, hopefully there'll be hundreds. When there's hundreds, it'll make sense if you're not caught up. But right now, what are you doing, man? Come on, go catch up. So if you don't watch the last episode I talked about all the games that I had beaten up until that point in 2025. Except not technically, because I recorded the opening to the show. I recorded the opening to the show, and then I went and played some games before I came back and recorded the bulk of the show. And in that time, I actually beat 2 new games. So I have those 2 games to talk about this week, but I also have a few more. In total, I have 6 games to talk about today that I've played, and that's probably all we're going to talk about today is those 6 games. I'm probably not going to get into any Switch 2 stuff, because I was thinking about it. obviously Switch 2 is kind of the hot news right now in Nintendo. It's no secret, right? But the direct is, or the presentation, I guess I should say. I don't know that it's actually titled a direct. It might just be a presentation. That's on April 2nd. So we have like 5 shows, I think, until then, excluding today. So we've got plenty of time to talk about the Switch 2, my thoughts on the Switch 2, predictions for the Switch 2. We've got plenty of time, right? We've got hours and hours to talk about that stuff. And then even when the presentation happens, I'll talk about that, and then I'll have plenty of stuff to talk about regarding that until the Switch 2 comes out. And then even when it comes out, I'll have stuff to talk about with my thoughts on it, right? So, like the rest of the year, honestly, we're going to be talking about mostly Switch 2. It's totally fine if this week I talk about other stuff instead. And I'm sure you'll be surprised to hear that I have not played any Switch 2 games in the last week because they don't exist yet. I mean, I guess maybe they do. Maybe they're ready, right? But none of them are out, right? So, anyways, enough blabbering. Although I've said that like 3 times now, and we're only 6 minutes in, so it's not the best news. I guess we'll do a little. Oh, you know what? Never mind. I just forgot about something. I've got to talk about the listener mail, of which we got literally none. I'm pretty sure. Yeah, just wanting the podcast Undungu for YouTube. So, if you're new around here, I'm gonna say it every episode. So if you're not new around here, well, sorry. Uh, but anyways, you can email the show and ask me questions, give me comments, any of that stuff, on Gmail at notjustnintendo@gmail.com. And that is NOTJUSTNINTENDO, all one word, at gmail.com. You can also, if you're listening on YouTube, just leave a comment. That's really simple, really fast if you're on YouTube. I think that's actually where the vast majority of people are. But there were a few streams on Spotify last I knew. So if you're on Spotify, give me a little shout, say hello. And you can say hello in the comment section of Spotify as well. If you're on Spotify, you can comment. I didn't realize you could do that until I made the podcast and put it out there. And then it was like, here are your comments. I'm like, comments? What comments? I didn't realize you could comment. So apparently you can comment. So if you know how to do that on Spotify, go right ahead. I check those analytics frequently, so you can check that. You can comment on YouTube, and then you can email at notjustnintendo@gmail.com. If I don't have any mail, that's fine. I just won't read any, right? Because there won't be any to read. But if you'd like to leave any mail, feel free. I'll happily answer your questions or respond to your suggestions or concerns or whatever the sort. All right, well, let's roll some music, and then we'll hop right into the games I played since last show. So the first game I beat since last show, or at least since the games that I talked about on the last show, was Kirby 64, The Crystal Shards. And I'm 90% sure that is actually the name of the game, because it's a little hard to tell, is it Kirby 64? Is it Kirby and the Crystal Shards? Is it Kirby 64 and the Crystal Shards? Or is it just Kirby 64, The Crystal Shards? And actually, I'm totally going to look that up, because I cannot remember for the life of me what the full... Yes, Kirby 64, The Crystal Shards, with a semicolon in there. So that is the name of the game. That's the game I beat. I beat it on February 18th. It took me a total of about 4 hours, 15 minutes, about 4.25 hours. And Kirby 64 is pretty good. It's a pretty good game. It's really fun. As far as 2D platformers go, it's really high up there. I guess this is, it's a 2.5D game, right? It's one of those, that's kind of a weird category. I think originally 2.5D did mean stuff like Kirby 64 and like Klonoa and that kind of stuff, right? But I think over the years, there have been some things that people call 2.5D that, it's a little, I don't know. I don't even know if that's technically the correct definition, because I thought it was supposed to be like the game is actually rendered in 3D, but then you move on a 2D plane. But like, there's also games like Donkey Kong, I almost said Donkey Kong 64, sorry. Donkey Kong Country, the old one, the 3 originals. Those kind of games, they're 3D visuals, but the game itself is in 2D, and you're also on a 2D plane. So I think something even like modern Donkey Kong Country, or like most 2D platformers that aren't pixel art, I think those aren't 2.5D. They're very much 2D. And then stuff like Kirby 64 or like Klonoa or that kind of thing, though, or even like Yoshi's Story, right? Those games are actually 2.5D. But it's honestly, it's not a category. I think it's a pretty loose category. I don't think anyone's gonna get upset with you for getting that a little bit wrong. If I, actually, I think there was this conversation early on in the Jeff Gerstmann show. I've been watching through the beginnings of that, and I'm gonna slowly go through the whole backlog. Of course, his shows are quite long, so it's a little tough. But the good news is he hasn't been going that long, so it's not as difficult. Um, anyways, so back to Kirby 64. So Kirby, I started my Kirby adventure with Kirby's Adventure, I believe, right? Is that correct? Yes. I started my Kirby adventure with Kirby's Adventure, on NES. That was sorry, there was a little bang there. I dropped something. Kirby's Adventure, I beat last year back in 2024. I know all that time ago, back in my day, right? I beat it on May 8th in about 2.5 hours on NES. And I've got to say, Kirby's Adventure, man, that game is way better than it should be, considering it's an NES game. I know it's like a late NES game, right? But I think it's just honestly, I think it's in a lot of regards, it might even be one of the best. I don't want to definitively say it's the best, but it's definitely up there as far as games on the NES. Period. You know, whether they're Nintendo games, whether they're platformers, whether they're it doesn't matter. Either way, Kirby not 64. Kirby's Adventure is very high up there. And then I got on a little bit of a Kirby kick. Of course, I was playing these all on NSO. I played Kirby's Dream Land literally the next day because, of course, it's only half an hour. I'm not quite as hot on Kirby's Dream Land. Obviously, I can respect that it's the first one, but I think Kirby's Adventure is also very old and it's far better. Of course, they were working on better hardware, but I don't know. It's still an interesting thing. And then I played Kirby's Dream Land the next day after that. Kirby's Dream Land, or sorry, Dream Land 2, I should say. Dream Land 2 is definitely better than the first one by quite a bit, but it's nowhere near as good as Kirby's Adventure. And then I played Kirby's Dream Land 3 2 days later, and Kirby's Dream Land 3 is, I would say, still not as good as Kirby's Adventure, but it's the best of the Dreamland games. So I played those 4 games, and now I've played Kirby 64, the Crystal Shards, quite a few months later. I guess, what, 9 months later. Someone could have had a baby since I beat Kirby's Dream Land. That's a weird thing to say, isn't it? Between me playing Kirby's Dream Land 3 and Kirby 64, someone could have had a child. Uh, Anyways, that's a weird thing to say. But yes, I've now played all of the Kirby's up until that point, I think, right? Because the Amazing Mirror came out after Kirby 64, I believe. I could be wrong. I did start the Amazing Mirror like a while ago before I was even done with Crystal Shards, and then I don't know, I kind of just got away from it. I didn't think it was all that new or different for Kirby. But yes, I've been playing through the old Kirby games. Kirby 64, it probably is my second favorite one. Actually, yeah, no, it's totally my second favorite one. I don't see a world in which this could be behind anything but Adventure, and I do think it is behind Adventure. I don't know, there's some levels and stuff that were really, really phenomenal in Kirby 64, and I've got to say, Kirby 64, man, it's a really solid platformer. I would say if I have one complaint, well, it's not even that bad, but it's kind of weird for a Kirby game. And that's that the bosses are like freaking hard, man. I don't know, maybe it's just me, maybe not everybody has this issue, but I definitely had this issue, and I'm definitely someone who's pretty good at 2D platformers. Kirby 64, man, the bosses are hard. They're hard, hard as nails. Hard as a rock, and I don't mean shale, like there was the one boss, I don't this is much of a spoiler, right? It doesn't even matter. It's a 2D platformer without really a story. There was the lava boss, I guess you could say. Like it's like this large oval shaped pool of lava, I suppose, with eyeballs, and it's out in the background. And this actually happens for for a few bosses, at least at the end. Um, there's like it's in the background, and you beat it, and then there's a second phase where it's now in the foreground on the side of the screen, or something. And sometimes it's the other way around, but there's 2 different phases. Usually, one of the phases the boss is in the foreground, one of the phases the boss is in the background. So it's an interesting concept to do it like that, I suppose. Um, Personally, I did find a few of the bosses annoying. I know I got a little stuck on the lava boss, like I was just saying. The lava boss, there's basically, I think there's 4 platforms that Kirby can stand on, and they're rather small. And the boss, they have a few different attacks. There's the one attack, it's not really much of an attack, where they summon up 3 like lava bubbles, and you can swallow the bubbles and get the firepower. And that's how you damage the boss. I don't think there's really any other way to do it unless you're already bringing in a different power up from the level or from another level or something. So you have to use the firepower against the fire boss, which is a little strange, but it works. And then there's another attack where the boss will send out these giant spires of lava, I suppose you could say. And you can see them coming from far away. But they'll come out and they'll run into one of the platforms you can stand on, and it'll like push it up because there's lava on the top and on the bottom of the scene. So you can get pushed into the lava. So you have to kind of time it in such a way where you're not standing on the platform that's being pushed up. And that's not so bad. But what's annoying is that if you try to attack the boss during that phase, if you jump up and you hit the button and you smash into the boss, when Kirby has a firepower, when he only has one firepower, he does his move is like, I don't know, I don't really know how to describe it. It's kind of a field of energy fire behind him, and then he thrusts forward in a fireball and he's like spinning, right? So if you do that and hit the boss when he's in that phase, you'll sometimes randomly fall down and land in the lava below, and it seems to be just random. Like, I don't understand why it happens sometimes. It's very strange. Unless it's the final hit, then you're fine. So that's one of his attacks. There's another attack where he sends out just 2 spires, and they're very tall, and then they, like, fold down inwards across a platform. So you have to be away from both of those, and that's really the best place to attack them. So there might even be more attacks that I'm not thinking of, but I remember I struggled a little bit with that boss because, like I said, it felt weird as to when I was actually supposed to attack him. I think it was during the thinner spires, I guess, that fold in rather than the tall ones that push you up. I think is when I was actually supposed to attack the boss, right? But it was a little hard to tell. And then you beat the boss, and you're like, "Oh yes, I did it." And then it's a second phase. It's like, "Oh my god, what is this? An RPG?" Like, and now the boss is in the foreground. And I will say, actually, that boss is quite a bit easier. But there's still the same problem that it seems like sometimes when you use your attack, you'll like get hit in the process, and it's quite irritating. Because Kirby, and I guess this is a problem with Kirby in general. Kirby's like so slow. Like you might even be faster in the air than you are on land, and you feel very slow, very plodding on land. And to be like a puffball, like you're literally like so light, you would think you'd be able to move pretty fast. But I guess they're trying to incentivize you flying around more. I don't know. Whatevs. I just don't really like how Kirby feels to control. Which is partially why I don't mind at all how, Kirby is so easy, because I think the game needs to be easy to compensate for the fact that Kirby himself doesn't really feel all that great to control. And there's, definitely 2D platformers. I think I'm quite refined in my taste of 2D platformers. I like Donkey Kong, I like Mario. Those are really the main 2. But I've played other stuff. I played like Rayman Legends, right? I think Rayman feels quite nice to control. But in a game like Kirby, I don't think Kirby really feels super great, to be honest. But the level design's usually pretty good, so you can usually get by, right? And certainly in Kirby 64, the levels themselves weren't too hard. They were quite long, I should say. So in general, this is definitely a harder Kirby than any of the other ones I've played thus far. I guess you can make an argument that the first Dreamland is kind of tough because it was such a short game that they were trying to really, pack in some playtime in there. That's how games used to be, right? But honestly, I don't think it was terribly difficult. But you can make an argument that it's more difficult than most of the games. I still think Kirby 64 is more difficult. But it wasn't so difficult that I was like struggling too much. I guess there was the one boss. There was another boss actually I struggled with a little bit where it's a shark and he doesn't really provide all that many enemies to give you powers. There's a few every now and then, but you have to swallow an enemy, and then you have a boomerang usually as the power up you can get in the arena. And basically, the shark moves side to side across the screen. There's like a little bit of warning as to where he's going to come, and then you have to both dodge him, but also find a way to hit him while also getting out of the way. And I mean, it might sound pretty simple, but the problem is that Kirby, after he throws the boomerang, he like very slowly sinks down in the water. So like you'll throw a boomerang, and then it takes all this time for Kirby to get low enough, and you can't get high, you can't jump while you're in the air in the water. You have to wait till you hit the ground, and you hit the ground very slowly when you have the boomerang. So if he's above you, you don't want to, or sorry, if he's below you, you don't want to attack at all because you're gonna land on the ground in front of him, and there's no like invincibility after performing a hit. It's only after taking a hit. So you kind of have to wait until he's above you and then do it, and then hope that you fall fast enough to not get hit. And that was quite annoying. And then, of course, when you beat that boss, there's another phase once again, and this time he's coming up from below you, and that one was probably quite a bit easier than the first phase. And I will say that's another thing. It feels like with the bosses that have phases, which it might be all of them, it might be just some of them. I can't recall exactly. But with the ones with phases, it definitely felt like the first phase was like much harder than the second phase. Like the second phase was always the easier phase, which I mean, I guess you are like you have lower health and stuff, but you would expect the first phase to like, not be so difficult, and then the second phase, like you're warmed up, you know what the boss does. Now you've got the real challenge. But it seems really backwards. And it's kind of jarring for a Kirby game to have difficult bosses because Kirby's not a difficult game, right? And it's also jarring that the levels themselves are so easy, but then the bosses are so difficult. So it's a little jarring. I know I just said jarring like 3 times in a minute, or not even. But that's really how I can describe it. As far as the levels themselves, there were some really nice levels. I thought the backgrounds, they looked very nice. I can't deny that I probably would have liked to see a 64 Kirby game that was pixel art because of course you had the 64 and the PlayStation. Obviously the PlayStation came first, but they were both in the 5th generation, right? And they were kind of the two biggest console. I mean, obviously by far the two biggest consoles. Obviously PlayStation was much more popular than the 64, but they were the two biggest. And on the PlayStation you got a lot of games that were in 2D and that were in pixel art and stuff. They hadn't fully moved. Like most of the games were in 3D and in that like obviously more polygonal, I don't know, polygonal style. Whereas on the 64, like everything was. On the PlayStation's, there was only something. I think the majority of stuff was polygonal, but there were definitely some games, especially like look at like Castlevania Symphony of the Night is probably the best example, and the pixel art on that game is phenomenal because they had more power than the Super Nintendo. So regardless of what the game being 3D or whatever, it doesn't matter, right? If you have the 2D game on the Super Nintendo and you have a 2D game on the 64 or the PlayStation, obviously the PlayStation was more powerful than the 64, but even on the 64, the pixel art looks way better on the 64 because they came so far, and they had these like modern effects on a pixel art background. And I think there's a lot of games on PS1 that, as a result, look really nice. I think the original Rayman's a good example as well. But on 64, you didn't get any of those. And you may have if the thing performed better. I think a lot of why there were so few games is because it performed so poorly and it was late. The PlayStation came out like over a year, I believe, before the 64, I think. I don't know. It was about a year, I think, in the West. I think in Japan it was even longer. But anyways, enough rambling. We just spent 15 minutes talking about Kirby somehow. But yes, overall, Kirby 64, actually, I will say my favorite level. Probably my favorite level, yeah. There was a level where you get in, and there might have even been 2 levels like this, or at least a level and a half or something, because there's different sections. There's distinct sections of every level. There's a few different sections. And there's usually like a mini boss in most levels as well. My favorite level, there was a section where you get in like a sled, right? You're in the snow world. You get in a winter sled, and I think there was even a minecart level too, but there's a sled and there's a minecart, and there's a few times that this happens in the game, and it felt just like the minecarts in Donkey Kong Country, though admittedly a bit easier. It wasn't as difficult, but I really liked the minecart sections in Donkey Kong Country, and it was quite similar to that. I felt when you were in the snowmobile or in the minecart in Kirby. So that was definitely a fun little thing. I was like, oh my gosh, it's like Donkey Kong, right? And Donkey Kong, I definitely in the first game. I think maybe in the other two. I'm talking mainly about the Super Nintendo ones, less about the modern ones. Although I guess Donkey Kong Country Returns is now, what is it, like 15 years old? So it's definitely still modern, but it won't be modern for long, right? It'll be old fairly soon, right? And maybe give it 10 years, we can call that game maybe even retro in 10 years. God, that'd be crazy. I don't know. We'll see, right? Anyways, but yes, but certainly in like old Donkey Kong Country, at least in the original, you had like the two different types of minecart levels, which was kind of, which, I thought it was kind of weird and funny. And there's the one minecart level where, and I think there's a few of each in the game. There's one type of minecart level where you jump in the minecart, the whole minecart jumps, which is a little strange if you think about it. You'll be coming up on an obstacle, you jump, and then the whole minecart jumps with you. I don't know if they like, the power of the Kongs, they like grab the minecart and pull it up with them off the rails. I don't know. Maybe I shouldn't be questioning the realism of a monkey game, right? Uh, but then the other type of minecart level, which maybe made more sense, was when you jump and the characters actually jump out of the minecart and then land back in, which, to be fair, actually that doesn't make sense either. So I don't know. But anyways, it's not about logic. It's just the idea that both of those two different minecart levels, and you never knew which one was which. There'd be a minecart level. Sometimes you jump out of the cart, and other times you stay in the cart when you jumped, and it was really strange. And in Kirby 64, I believe you always jump with the cart and not out of the cart. So that's what it's analogous to, I suppose. All right, but again, I said enough talking about Kirby, and I said that like 3 minutes ago, and I kept talking. So I'll stop now. So on the same day as Kirby 64, because I guess I'll go back to Kirby real quick. I started Kirby like back like mid-January maybe, and I didn't finish it till mid-February because I was definitely slow rolling it, right? I played it for a little while and then I got away from it, and I played it for a while, got away from it, and then finally I came back, and I think it was probably like a third session where I finally finished it up. But on the same day, I finally finished, or I not really finally. I actually blew through this one very, very fast. I beat my first Metroid game, and I'm actually very excited to talk about this on the show. I think I'll likely be talking about Metroid for the majority of this episode. I played and beat within like 2 days. I started it late at night, not like you know midnight, but I started at probably 8 or 9 o'clock, and then I beat it the next day, probably 8 or 9 o'clock. So I worked on it over the course of 24 hours, but I wasn't going for 24 hours straight. I beat Metroid Zero Mission in 5 hours, and I was gonna say 25 minutes. It's 5.25, so 5 hours 15 minutes roughly. I beat Metroid Zero Mission on Switch NSO, and man, Metroid's always been something. Always been a Nintendo fan, right? I mean, maybe not when I was a month old, but I think by the time I was like 2 years old, I was probably, I'd seen my dad play games and stuff. I probably was like, oh, those I like Mario, right? Or maybe I didn't know his name, but I was at least, maybe I wasn't aware at 2, but at least by 3, I was aware, like, oh, Mario, right? So, and Nintendo, right? I was a big fan of Nintendo. I'm still a big fan of Nintendo. That's why the podcast is named how it is, right? And certainly Metroid was something that, you hear all the time. I think it mostly comes from the Metroid superfans, right? They're like, yeah, Metroid's one of Nintendo's most popular franchises. And I'm like, I guess technically, if you're listing Nintendo franchises, there's really not that many, that are currently active, right? And I mean, it's sort of questionable whether Metroid's ever active, but because it takes, long stretches of inactivity. So I guess technically, right, as far as the amount of games and the amount of like hardcore super fans, yeah, sure, it's one of their most popular. But as far as sales figures, I guess it's still technically one of the most, right? Like maybe it's in the top 10, but it's certainly nowhere near the level of even Zelda, and of course Zelda historically hasn't sold all that well. And obviously it doesn't touch Mario, it doesn't touch, Mario Kart. And nowadays it really doesn't touch Animal Crossing. I don't think it really ever did, but Animal Crossing has certainly gotten a lot more popular over the years. So Metroid is nowhere near the top on the sales charts. But as far as like the amount you hear about it all the time. And I think the biggest reason is probably, well, it's so good, but also because it was, defined a genre, right? I mean, the Metroidvania, I guess you could say, like, Mario defined the platforming genre, right? There's definitely arguments to be made. But, like, Metroid is literally half the name of Metroidvania, right? Of course, the other half being Castlevania. So, really, you can only attribute the genre of Metroidvanias either to the original Metroid, to the first Castlevania, both of which are questionably Metroidvanias, or you attribute it to Super Metroid or Symphony of the Night. Those are the only four games you could possibly attribute as the namesake, or as not the heir, but you know what I mean, as the main pillar of the category. And certainly, when you hear people's favorite Metroidvanias, you usually hear Super Metroid, maybe you hear Symphony of the Night. There's definitely been some talk more recently. Obviously it came out more recently for like Hollow Knight. There's definitely a crowd of people. A lot of those people are already like Souls people, so they're kind of Souls people turned to Metroidvania people. But I think generally the most popular answer as far as favorite Metroidvania is by far Super Metroid, and then Castlevania Symphony of the Night is probably second place there. And my history with Metroid, like I said, I've always been a Nintendo fan, and all these people have talked about how popular and how, well, not even necessarily popular, how amazing Metroid is. And I was like, yeah, I've got to love Metroid, right? I'm not a Nintendo fan if I don't like Metroid. You see like the memes, and it'll be like, it'll be like the two people. I don't know exactly how to describe this meme template, but it'll be like the two people, and it'll be like, I'm a Nintendo fan, right? And then it's like, um, you know, Metroid and Advance Wars and Fire Emblem, and they're slightly. I mean, I guess Fire Emblem's not really obscure anymore, is it? But they're slightly more obscure Nintendo franchises. And then it's the other person. They're like, "Oh, me too." And then it's like Mario and Zelda and Mario Kart, right? And the idea is, that you're a Nintendo fan on a surface level, but then there's Nintendo fans that go much deeper and play more of the deep cuts and stuff. And I was like, I got to be a real Nintendo fan, right? I've got to play Metroid, right? And it wasn't even just that like specific meme, right? It was just in general the conversation around Nintendo games and around Metroid and stuff. It's like I gotta love Metroid. Metroid, it's one of the best games ever. I kept telling myself this even though I hadn't played it, right? So finally, back in 2024, probably in March or so, I think was the first time I was like, I'm gonna play Super Metroid, right? And I had played a little bit here and there of it, right? But this was the first time I was seriously like, I'm gonna play and beat Super Metroid, right? So I set out in March of 2024, and I did not get very far. I spent hours, but I did not make hours of progress. I was like, oh my god, Super Metroid, this game sucks, right? I was constantly stuck. I would play the game for like 5 minutes, and then I'd be stuck for an hour. And it's so impossible to look up a guide for that game, to figure out where you're supposed to go because people do things in different orders. They solve puzzles in different ways. They have different power ups by the time they get to things. And it's like sometimes I would feel trapped. There'd be like a one-way wall. I'd shoot it, not like a wall, but like there's those switches, right? You shoot the switch and then you can go through the door. But they're only one way, right? Once you're through the door, you can't come back. And I was like, surely, this happened many times during my trying to play Super Metroid. I was like, surely there's a way because I couldn't progress. I was like, surely there's a way back so I can leave this area, go get the item I need, and then come back, right? And I could never find it. I was like, surely there's a hole in the floor or something, right? But all of these gods on YouTube were people that knew how to play the game, and so they never used that. And I was like, oh my god, I can't find this. And I would scroll through hours and hours and hours of play, and I'm not even exaggerating, man. I literally spent hours because I was like, I have to play this game. And long story short, actually, long story still quite long. I was like, I'm never playing Super Metroid again. I quit, right? So then about 3 months later, I came back and I tried to play it again. Probably like July, so I guess 4 months later, right? I tried to play it again, and the same thing happened. I got a little further, but the same thing happened. I kept getting stuck. I was like not having fun. I was, you have those couple minutes where you're actually playing and not getting stuck. You're like, man, this game's amazing. And then you get stuck and you're like, oh, this game sucks, right? There's no in between. It's either amazing or absolutely dreadful, like Metroid Dread, right? Anybody? So absolutely was like, I cannot play this game. So I was like, I'm never playing this game again, and I stopped, right? So then about 3 months later, I came back again in October. I was like, I'm playing this game, and who would have guessed? Third time was not the charm. I struggled once again. So, since October, the last time I tried to seriously play Super Metroid, and I hated it, I was like, you know what? Maybe Metroid's not for me. Maybe Metroidvanias are for me. Maybe I'm not that. Maybe that's not my thing. But I was like, but there's so many games that are. Well, there's really not that many. But there's a lot of like critically acclaimed Metroidvanias, a lot of indies and stuff now, and there's a whole series of Nintendo games, and there's the Castlevania series. I've got to like Metroidvanias. I can't not like Metroidvanias, right? There's so many games that I would be missing out on if I, didn't like Metroidvanias. So for the last few months, I've thought about it, and I finally got access to the Switch Online expansion pack. And I thought to myself, I was like, you know what? Maybe Super Metroid isn't the game for me. Or maybe it's not the game to get me into Metroid, right? Maybe it'll still be great. Maybe I'll play Super Metroid soon and I'll be like, this is amazing. And I'll be here in a few weeks' time talking about how phenomenal and incredible Super Metroid is. It's the best game I've ever played, right?
But I was like, surely this is not the thing that's going to get me into the genre. But I still wanted to get into the genre with a Metroid game and not with anything else because it would feel wrong to get in as a Nintendo guy to get into Metroidvanias with anything but Metroid, right? So, I sat down. This is a couple weeks ago now. It was actually not a couple weeks. It was just over 1 week actually. And I was like, you know what? I'm gonna play Metroid Zero Mission because I had heard, people. I've even heard people say that you should start with Super Metroid because it's the best one. And for anybody who isn't into Metroidvanias, do not start with Super Metroid. Start with Metroid Zero Mission because it's a lot more clear. You don't tend to get as stuck as much. When you get stuck, you're not as stuck, and you don't get stuck as often. And I think it truly is a lot more streamlined. Even if Super Metroid's better, that's fine, right? Super Metroid's maybe too open as your first Metroidvania, whereas Metroid Zero Mission was great. And I'll say that again. Metroid Zero Mission is great. The game is phenomenal, right? I'm like I have finally I've been awoken as a Metroid fan. All right, welcome me into the fandom. Although I don't think anybody's gonna be very welcoming after me complaining about Super Metroid. But I promise I'll play that game and I'll like it probably. Just it wasn't gonna be a good first Metroidvania. And Metroid Zero Mission, man, it's great. I'm almost thinking maybe I should um, go off and play all the Metroid games and then come through and talk about every single one with like spoilers, talk about the story because the story is like surprisingly interesting. I thought it was going to be pretty not interesting, but it's surprisingly interesting. And Metroid Zero Mission, there's that whole part after the game that they added. Essentially, it's after the game, right? It's still part of the game, but they added it from the original game because I don't know. There might be somebody who doesn't know. Metroid Zero Mission is a remake of the original Metroid for NES, but I'd almost say it's a reimagining, right? Like it's very different. There's a lot of improvements, a lot of changes, a lot of additions, even to the story, right? Like there's a whole key section of the game after you like seemingly beat the game that's added to Zero Mission before you actually beat the game, right? Because in NES Metroid it ends a little bit more abruptly, but in Zero Mission it's much more fleshed out. Um, so yes, Zero Mission absolutely phenomenal. I should I just do some like spoilers for what happens? Yeah, I'll talk about some of the bosses and some of the stuff. I'll talk here about Metroid Zero Mission for just a few minutes, probably. I'll probably try to keep it brief. So 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Okay, so Metroid Zero Mission, after you do the escape sequence, because there's another one later, but you do the escape sequence after fighting Mother Brain. Of course, the whole game you're here like, we gotta fight Mother Brain, right? That's the boss. And you defeat Mother Brain, and honestly, you're not fighting Mother Brain. You're fighting the room Mother Brain's in, because Mother Brain, you have to open the glass like not jar. I was gonna say jar. It's not really a jar, right? It's like a tank, right? It's a tank where Mother Brain's being held or stuff, right? And you shoot it with a few missiles. And in the room you're standing, there are a few enemies that I would say there's enemies that kind of fly around and they respawn when you shoot them or whatever. But there's also these like cannons that shoot like cannonballs, right? Most cannons tend to. And they're around as well. So and they're constantly moving. So it's not like you can just stand in one spot. And in the original NES version, Mother Brain has no attacks. You just, I believe, right? I'm pretty sure. I could be wrong. I'm pretty sure she has no attacks, or I don't know if it's really. I guess it's Mother Brain, right? Mother she. Anyways, um, and you just shoot it with missiles. You dodge out of the way of the stuff in the room, and then you come back and you shoot some more missiles, dodge and shoot some more missiles, rinse and repeat until you're done. But in Metroid Zero Mission, it's kind of the same thing, but Mother Brain has an attack that she performs occasionally. Of course, she's stationary, but she can like shoot out a large beam of energy from her eye, I guess. Um, and that can also add to the chaos. And the Mother Brain boss fight very much chaotic. So that was the final boss of the original game. In Metroid Zero Mission, after that, you leave the planet. You have the escape sequence. You leave the planet on your ship, and then you get shot down, or you get like I think you get shot down, and then you have to infiltrate Now, without your Metroid suit, or your power suit, I should say, without your suit, you have to infiltrate the like facility. I don't even actually know what it is. It's like, I don't know. It's some sort of like castle or something. Maybe it's the Chozo ruins. I don't know. I'm not the best guy to ask about Metroid lore, but anyways, you have to infiltrate the place, and you have to do so like stealthily. And it was actually really cool. And you're missing all your abilities, or at least most of them. You have a stun gun instead of an actual arm cannon. Like, it's very interesting. And there's these Metroids around that you absolutely cannot kill. You have to stun them, and they don't stay stunned for long. And you have to like sneak around them and get your way back to your suit, which is pretty cool. And then there's a couple more upgrades, or maybe there's just one or something. There's more upgrades, and then you beat Mecha or Neo Ridley, maybe. I don't know. I think it's Mecha Ridley. There's another Ridley. Yeah, it's Mecha Ridley. Um, you fight Ridley again as a mech, and honestly, Mecha Ridley is like very easy. At least for the point in the game that he's at. But I still thought he was an interesting boss fight. And then after Mecha Ridley, you have another boss fight, or sorry, another escape sequence, not a boss fight. You have another escape sequence, and then you actually beat the game. And I was a little skeptical. I'm like, did I actually beat it, or is there more? So that whole added section where you have to run from the Chozos, and of course, if you're spotted, you have to like actually just like run for it, and you'll have like all these Chozos, like Chozos? No, not Chozos. Sorry, all these Metroids chasing you, and I think they're Metroids, right? Yeah, are they? I don't know. Anyways, you got all these things chasing you, and it's quite tense, to be honest. Uh, but it was fun. It was very fun, and I think that's generally a sentiment I carry for Zero Mission in general. It's a very fun game. There were some parts where I got stuck. I don't think I ever got nearly as stuck as in Super Metroid, but I did have to look up a guide for a few things, here and there. Actually, I mean, I guess it was actually quite a few things, to be fair. But it wasn't nearly as bad as Super Metroid, and if I had any questions, I was actually able to find the answers, whereas I wasn't for Super Metroid. I guess that's all I'll say for spoilers and stuff. Again, I'll probably come back and talk about all the Metroids, or at least maybe all the 2D ones when I beat all the 2D ones, and maybe the Prime games when I beat those, or maybe I'll just talk about them all in one. We'll see. Um, we'll have to see when we get there. So, Metroid Zero Mission was the second game that I beat since the last show, out of, again, maybe six, or at least five. The third game was Final Fantasy II. Final Fantasy II, I beat in a total of 20 hours, and I beat this one on February 20th. So it wasn't the same day as all these other ones, it was 2 days later. So Final Fantasy II, I beat Final Fantasy I on February 4th, and then I hopped right into Final Fantasy II, I believe on the same day. Maybe it was the day, maybe it was the next day. So I've been playing this for a little while, and I basically played all of the game back in like a week, and then I got stuck on the final boss, and I took like a couple weeks off or a week off or something, and then I came back and finished it a few days ago. So the final boss, okay, I guess I'll talk more with Final Fantasy One. With Final Fantasy One, I went through the game and I was not like grinding while doing the game. I even turned off random encounters because I was playing the Pixel Remaster for like two of the dungeons, I believe. And I definitely had to pay the price later because I was struggling hardcore against the boss. And I had to go away and grind in the final dungeon, which honestly, it really didn't take very long. It was like 45 minutes, and I came back and was able to beat him. In Final Fantasy II, I made a similar mistake. I didn't turn off random encounters or anything. But what I did do is I didn't level up my spells. So in Final Fantasy II, you have a garbage leveling system, to be honest. The leveling system in Final Fantasy 1 is fine. It's a normal RPG leveling system. Of course, Final Fantasy, one of the earlier RPGs. Really, I guess Ultima is arguably the first, and then Dragon Warrior or Dragon Quest, right? But then you had Final Fantasy was kind of the next one, I believe, unless I'm mistaken. But it was very early, right? And it's a very standard RPG leveling system. But Final Fantasy II had to like take all that and just chuck it out the window, like just absolutely just hurl that thing like 100 feet, right? Because you no longer have levels at all. There's no such thing as a character level anymore. Instead, you level up individual stats, and you can level up like your arms. Like you can dual wield weapons, and you can level up your right arm and your left arm independently. and it's based on how much you use that arm in the battle, which is a little strange. You can also level up the weapons themselves, and you can level up like your evasion just by I don't know, happening to dodge an attack. You can level up your HP by getting hit a lot. It's a very strange system. It's honestly, it's garbage. It's a bad system. It's not a good system because the spells take ages to level up. And so I went through the whole game, and I started at the beginning. I was like, I want to use some of these spells and stuff, but the spells are so horrible in the early game. They do like no damage compared to your basic attacks that I was like, you know what? I'm just going to use basic attacks. So I went through the whole game using almost exclusively basic attacks. So I got to the final boss, and I have all these like level 1, level 2 spells, and I was like struggling like crazy. I was like, oh my gosh, I cannot beat this. So I had to go back, and I kid you not, I spent no less than like 6.5 hours grinding to level up my spells. Now, how long to beat says this game was supposed to take 21 hours. I got to the final dungeon in like 14. So that other 6.5 got me pretty close to the actual amount that how long to beat suggested. So really, it was just that I should have been leveling up my spells throughout the game, and I didn't. But if you're ever going to play this game, level up your spells, man. Even though they suck, you got to level them up because otherwise you'll end up in the same position that I was in, where you just can't do enough damage against the boss. You can't heal enough against the boss. And that's the thing. Like, what kills me, and it was the same problem I had with Final Fantasy One, because in general I liked these games quite a lot, right? But I had the same problem with both Final Fantasy One and Final Fantasy Two, and that's that I like breezed through almost the entire game, right? It was like so easy, you know, barely an inconvenience. This is a Ryan George reference. Anyways, it was super easy, right? Every boss I was killing. I think I only got like a couple, maybe one or two, um, total party like everybody dies, right? I think it only happened once or twice over both games, probably. I think it might have happened like once in each game until the final boss, right? Then I got quite a few. So Final Fantasy 1 and 2, even though I wasn't doing as much as I was supposed to, I was beating the bosses like they were nothing, like they were chumps. It was super easy. I guess Final Fantasy 2 is a little easier than 1. But then you get to the final boss, and all of a sudden you're just getting absolutely mutilated. And so if I was struggling through the game, and then the final boss mutilated me, I would understand. I'd be like, you know what? Yeah, makes sense. I got a little overconfident. I probably should have done a little more. I could understand that. But that's not what's happening here, because I got through the rest of the game so easily until the final boss. I'm like, dang it. And that's what frustrates me, because that is frustrating, right? If you're not having any difficulty in the game until the final boss, then it feels like they're just arbitrarily pumping up the boss's stats just to make you waste time grinding. And I guess really that is what they were doing, right? But it's very frustrating because you don't have to do that for the whole game. You only have to do it right at the end when you want to be done because you've been playing this game for 20 hours. You liked it, right? But now you lose all of the story stuff that was driving you through, all that stuff. It's gone because now you're just here grinding for a boss. And it's very frustrating. And I imagine that problem will persist through the original 6 Final Fantasy games. But oh well. At the end of the day, Final Fantasy II, I think overall, is quite the improvement on Final Fantasy One. Final Fantasy One, the story is like not there, and honestly, like I said, I've talked about it before. I don't really need story in my video games, but for an RPG, I mean, it does help, right? It's you kind of want it, right? There's some exceptions. Like I don't mind when it's not there in the Mario RPGs. And to be fair, the story in the Mario RPGs is there. It's just not anything too spectacular. Um, so but the Final Fantasy One, they're just like, oh, here's 4 crystals: the earth, the fire, the water, and the air crystals, and you've got to go gather them. Like I'm like, oh, okay. And then what? I fight some mystical being in a castle. Yep, I do. Okay, well, sure. And I guess you can't really judge Final Fantasy because, like I said, it was one of the first RPGs. So, really, the stuff later on was copying it, not the other way around. But it does feel a little like, okay, come on, people, like, what is this? Really? Like, I mean, come on. Final Fantasy 2 is a lot better. You have, your party switches out a little bit throughout the game. You have, like, actual storylines to follow. There's interesting things that happen. I want to say there's, like, reveals or anything, but it's certainly for considerably more interesting and more engaging than Final Fantasy 1 in a lot of ways. And mechanically as well, I think it's stronger, except for the leveling system. That's the one thing that Final Fantasy 1 beats 2 on. And overall, I do think 2 is still better than 1, but it could like completely blow 1 out of the water if it weren't for its leveling system. And they wouldn't even have to do anything. They could have just put in the Final Fantasy 1 leveling system and I'd have been happy. But instead, they came up with this garbage, weird, independent stat system or whatever, and you got to deal with it, and it sucks. And I guess that's enough complaining about Final Fantasy 2 because it was a really good game. I've got to admit, it was a good game. All right, so the next game that I beat is since the last episode, and of course I beat a lot of games here. I don't always. I'm probably not going to always have this many games to talk about. I had a time off school. I think I mentioned this in the opening segment, but I'm not recording these at the same time, so I can't remember off the top of my head. I'm not gonna. These aren't gonna always. I'm not gonna have this many games generally, probably to talk about. I might have quite a few. Not always gonna have this many. But this time I do because I had time off school. And it works out well because I really didn't want to talk about Switch 2 stuff because we still got a lot of time to talk about Switch 2 stuff. So it was really good to have all these games to talk about. And the next one of those games is, drumroll please. Are you drumrolling? You better be drumrolling. If you're not drumrolling, then I don't know, you should be. Anyways, the next of these games is Metroid Fusion. So of course I beat Metroid Zero Mission on the 18th, and then I immediately, literally the next like 5 minutes later, I started at Metroid Fusion. And I started that, and I beat that in just a couple days. And after Metroid Fusion, I realized, oh, maybe I shouldn't go blitz through all the 2D Metroids because there's only 5. And I beat 2 of them within 4 days. Or 4 days? No, 2 days. Within 2 days, 3 days, I beat 2 of them. I was like, maybe I shouldn't be doing that. So, yeah, I beat Metroid Fusion. Metroid Fusion, I don't know if I've come prepared to definitively say whether I prefer Fusion or Zero Mission. And I think most people would prefer Zero Mission. Fusion is also phenomenal in a lot of ways. It's interesting. I talked about in Zero Mission. Oh, man, should I spoil stuff? I'll not do spoilers for Fusion, and then I'll do them afterwards. So in Fusion, um, everybody talks about how it's much more linear than any of the other Metroid games, and at least from what I've played of Super Metroid and from my completion of Zero Mission, I can agree. Yes, it's far more linear. I don't mind that. I actually very much appreciate that because it meant that while in Super Metroid I was constantly stuck, and in Zero Mission I was sometimes stuck. In Fusion, I never got stuck. Or I mean, maybe I did like once or twice, but I almost never got stuck, and I definitely got stuck a lot less and a lot less bad than I did in Zero Mission. And obviously, Super Metroid was so bad I had to stop because I absolutely just could not deal with it. So Metroid Fusion, in my opinion, is much better in that regard. Of course, a lot of people will, maybe that's blasphemy, right? I'm not allowed to say that, but that's okay. I'll say whatever I want. Metroid Fusion, I want to go ahead and say it's better than Zero Mission, but I'm mixed. There are some things, Zero Mission did have a lot of cool things about it. You know what? No, Fusion's better. I prefer Fusion, but Metroid Zero Mission's still really good. And you know what? If you want to get into Metroidvanias, don't start with Fusion. Don't start with Super. Start with Metroid Zero Mission. And then either play them in order or probably Zero Mission and then Super, I would say is probably the best order to play them in. Because Fusion is a bit strange. It's not. I mean, again, I'm not the most qualified to talk about Metroid because I still have only played 2 games, and I'm not as familiar with the games as a lot of people. But from what I can tell, it's not the best one to start with. But I do think Fusion is my favorite of between the two, or really, I've played 3, right? But I haven't finished one of them. And I've now after this, I have Super Metroid to play. And then I'll have to go track down Samus Returns on 3DS, which shouldn't be too hard, although I don't really get out to game stores as often as I'd like. But I do, I get out there often enough. So, I'll probably be on the hunt for that. I'm sure this year I'll play Samus Returns. I don't know how soon, though. And then I'll probably play Dread this year, too. I'll probably end up playing all 5 Metroids this year, to be honest. All of the 2Ds. So I'm probably going to play Super Metroid next, and then we'll see if I play all the 2D games or if I jump into Metroid Prime, because I do have Metroid Prime Remastered. So I'm almost considering, because I don't have Dread or Samus Returns, playing the three 2D Metroid games and then playing Prime, and maybe at the same time, starting a 2D Metroid. I think you can play. I don't think you have to play those all in order. I don't think you have to play like all the 2Ds then all the 3Ds. I'm already not playing in order, right? I started with the first one, then I jumped to like the fourth one, and now I'm gonna play the third one, right? It's not. I'm not in order. I don't think you have to play the Metroid games in order too, um, because the story is definitely interesting, but I don't think it's like completely integral. You're definitely not going to be confused, because of story purposes, right? You're not going to get confused. Whether the story is as enjoyable not in order is, I guess, a little bit more up for debate. I would say it's fine. You don't have to worry about the order for Metroid, but you could definitely make an argument that it is mildly important. And again, so Fusion, I guess, I'll say a few things. Um, the in Fusion, so in Zero Mission and in Super Metroid, and presumably in the other games, but I haven't played them, there are like different color doors that you unlock with different missiles or bombs or, different things that you unlock for your mech suit. You unlock them all with different items, and they're color coordinated. So like there might be like a red door. I think maybe it's more pinkish in Super Metroid and in Zero Mission, and that door you can open with a missile. Or I should say, there's a blue door, which you can open just normally. In Zero Mission, the normal door doesn't have a color; it's like white, I guess. Then there is a red door, I think, in both Zero Mission and Super Metroid that you use like a missile for. And then there's like, a green door for a super missile, and then there's like a bomb door or a super bomb door. There's all those kind of doors, right? And that is a lot of the stuff that kind of hinders, it keeps you in the right area, right? So you can't just go immediately fight the final boss or something because he's behind a green door, right? Which is kind of a weird way to do it, but it makes sense. It's not weird having played the games, but at first glance, it seems like a strange way to do it. In Fusion, that system is not in place. There certainly are things that you have to have certain items, certain missiles, certain bombs to do. There's a lot of the stuff is more built into the environment. There might be like a pipe that you have to shoot with a specific missile. There might be an enemy that you like. There's these like weird long stringy things that you have to like shoot with an ice missile, and then they freeze and you can walk on them, right? And it's that kind of thing. Or there's one is like a weird eyeball thing. You have to shoot it with a super missile to get past, and it'll be blocking a doorway or something, right? And it's that kind of thing more so than the missiles. But there's also different types of doors, and they're color coordinated. But in Fusion, the progress in those doors is now blocked by different security levels. So, there's six different sectors, with different areas you can go to, plus the main area. And you generally have to go to them in a specific order. And you get to the sectors, and oftentimes you're in the sector to gain an ability or gain a type of missile or something. Other times you're in the sector to open a security level. So there's like 4 levels in the game. You get the first level pretty early, so you can open up. Ooh, is it which door is first? I know red's last. I think green is second to last. And then there's like a blue and another color. I don't know. Anyways, there's 4 levels. It's like something something green and red. I think it's something blue, green, and red. And once you unlock the first level, you can now open any door that's a certain color. Then you open the second level, you can open any door that's blue. You open the third level, any door that's green. Fourth level, any door that's red. And certainly the fourth level you get very late in the game. And then they're spaced out well throughout the game. And those are the kind of things that hinder progress more in Zero, or not in Zero Mission, in Fusion. Are these security level doors more so than the like missile doors like in the other games, or in some of the other games. I don't know if it's all of them or if it's just some of them. And I'm not sure that I like that better or worse. I don't think it. I think it's fine. It's a competent system. It doesn't really make a whole lot of difference to me. Um, but the reason I preferred Fusion is because I wasn't as confused playing it, and also I just think the power-ups you get are maybe a little bit more interesting. Obviously, they're very similar, but there's a couple minor differences. I think they're more interesting. And I was very interested in the story and the weird, almost like reveals and stuff that happen in Fusion. Not that they're anything like crazy groundbreaking, but I think they're more interesting than in Zero Mission. The one thing with Zero Mission, though, it is really cool, that final sequence that I talked about um, earlier in the like little spoiler section. That is really cool. So I don't know. I do prefer Fusion overall. I think probably, but I wouldn't be surprised if at the end of the year my opinions change and I end up putting Zero Mission first. We'll just have to see, right? So as far as like some light spoilers for Fusion, I guess I don't really have much to say about the story, but certainly how in Metroid Zero Mission there were that like stealthy segment. In Fusion, there is also a, I guess it's stealthy kind of element where there's the SAX, which is like a copy of Samus, I suppose, and you're not supposed you have to like run from it if it shows up. It doesn't show up all that often, to be fair, which honestly if it did it would probably not be good because then you wouldn't be able to progress and you would expect it to come up. But it comes up well enough or often enough in the game that it is like really a wake up call, like, oh shoot, I'm getting chased. It's one of those things. And there's also things where you can sometimes avoid getting chased depending on what route you take to get to different things, and it's interesting. Sometimes if the SAX comes, you can get away from it, and you can get away from it very quickly. But if you go in a certain door, now you're on the chase again, and it takes much longer to get away from it. So it's interesting how it works like that. Um, as far as infusion, you have Ridley, I think, was the boss I probably struggled with the most. You fight Ridley pretty late. And earlier on in the game, like throughout a lot of the game, you can go into a section, an area, um, that is like a freezer. It's like what is it, subarctic containment or something. And in there they have Ridley. So like you defeated Ridley, and then they put Ridley in the containment thing. From other games. From I think maybe Super was I think it was Super that you beat Ridley, right? So you beat Ridley as like the final boss or whatever. They put him in this containment facility in the cold like freezer, but he ends up getting out, and that's how you end up fighting him. And I think there's also was there Neo Ridley or something, or maybe that is the same boss. I don't know. I struggled with Ridley. Um, I think I actually struggled with Ridley more so than the final boss, the like SAX and the like thing. I don't know. It's like a larger SAX or whatever. Um, Another thing in Fusion, whereas in Super Metroid and in Zero Mission, you have enemies that can drop these like purple orbs that you use to heal, and they drop like missiles and stuff to refill. In Fusion, it's a similar system, but the enemies are comprised of these little like viruses. What are they called? What are they called? I don't know. They're like these little parasites. They're comprised of these things, and you use those things to heal, and you use those things to refill your missiles and stuff. But they like only stick around for a little while. You have to chase them down, and if you don't manage to get them, they'll respawn the enemy, or they'll respawn a different enemy. And certainly that can be kind of annoying sometimes, but I didn't mind it too much. It's still my favorite of the two games.
So the final game or final two games, depending on how you count it, that I beat since last week were The Last of Us Part 1 and The Last of Us Left Behind. So of course, The Last of Us Left Behind originally, so I should start. The Last of Us Part 1, it wasn't called Part 1 when it came out. The Last of Us came out on PS3 originally in 2013, if I'm not mistaken, and then they did a remastered with air quotes version on PS4 only a year later, which was really their way of having a cross-gen release without marketing it as such, and instead marketing it as a full-blown remaster of the game. But on the PS3 and I believe on the PS4 store, they put out Left Behind as like sort of a expansion, I guess, but it's not like DLC because it was purchasable standalone. I think the reason they did that is and didn't make it DLC is because if you bought like the PS3 version, Left Behind came out after the PS4 version. So if you bought the PS3 version, but not the PS4 version because you'd already played it on PS3, but you wanted to play the expansion and you didn't want to have to pull out the PS3 to do it, that way you could play the game on PS3 and the expansion on PS4. I think that's why they did it like that, because it came out so close to the end or the beginning of like the transition between the seventh and eighth generations, I suppose. So yes, The Last of Us Part One. I spent a total of 13.75, 13 hours 45 minutes. I beat that on February 22nd. I started it on the 20th. Yes, that's correct. I played it the 20th, the 21st, and I finished it on the 22nd. And then I went and played Left Behind, which only took about 2 hours. I finished that on the 22nd as well. So Left Behind, if you want to count it as a separate game because it came out standalone originally, then I guess you can go ahead and do so, in which case I beat 6 games since last time. Otherwise, you can say it's DLC, even though it came out standalone. It's DLC because, now in the latest remaster of Last of Us Part 1, they've just included it, and it honestly, if it weren't for the fact that it came out at the end of the generation, there's a good chance that they probably would have made it DLC. So, if you want to count it that way, then I only beat 5 games. But either way, I think that's still plenty to talk about. I think we've managed to make an episode here. The Last of Us Part 1, it's one of those games that, it's one of those, like, Sony first party. I guess it's not technically first party. I'd say it's, like, second party, right? Naughty Dog's, like, a second party studio. It's one of those, like, I mean, I would say, like, it's one of the Sony exclusive, like, behind the back, third person, sort of adventure games, I suppose. But it's something that's very story driven. You got God of War, you've got Horizon, even the Spider-Man games are quite story driven, I would say. It's another one of those, story driven games. And honestly, like I said, I've said this like, 10,000 times now. The story isn't really what does it for me. I will say that this story was very engaging, and it is probably a large part of why I enjoyed this game so much. Of course, it's kind of the driving factor when you're playing this game is the story, because honestly, the mechanics aren't like particularly special. At the beginning, like when I first started playing, I was like, yeah, the story is really cool, but the mechanics aren't holding up quite as much as I had hoped. But as I got through, I was like, well, you know what? Actually, this is pretty well made mechanically as well. I don't have any, I'm sure if I played this on PS3, I'd have all sorts of weird polish or lack thereof issues, and it'd probably be a bit of a mess. But thankfully, with them having remastered it twice now, it's all fixed up. And that's the thing. You've got to expect playing games on like PS3 and 360. You've got to expect some of those issues now and then. They don't have the same polish as stuff that Nintendo made. And that's I think generally why I'm such a fan of Nintendo, and why a lot of people who like Nintendo games are such a fan of Nintendo, because they put all this polish into the games. I also think they just have the best IPs. That they make the most interesting, the most creative, the most unique, and also just the best games all around. Um, but there's definitely room for the other games. Even if they're not like The Last of Us Part One is not going to be my game of the year or the game that I played this year, because I already have several games above it, right? But it's also not going to be low on the list. It'll probably be somewhere in the middle, and I'll talk about how much I loved it. It's like last year. I don't know if you guys watched. I mean, I presume probably some people did and some people didn't. I made that end of the year ranking of every game that I played in 2024. And I said, after like 2 or 3 games in, I was like, everything from here on out, I absolutely loved. I loved all these games, even if they didn't get too high on my list. The problem is, there were like 40 games I loved, even 40, 44, 43. And so I guess there was a list of 43, so maybe like 40 games that I really loved. There was only one on the list that I kind of didn't like, and I beat it just cause. Everything else I at least liked, and some of the games I really loved, and most of them I really loved. So it was really hard to make that list, and I'm already seeing the same problem this year, and honestly, it might even end up being a more difficult year. Um, but I suppose we'll see. I did think it'd be kind of cool if I added in, if I made like a running list. Let me know actually if you guys want to see. I know this isn't quite the same audience as my YouTube audience, but I think there's probably enough overlap. Let me know if you guys want to see like a running list, like you want me to add in all of these games to last year's list, or just start a new list. I think probably start a new list for the end of the year. Yeah, because I mean, a running list would be cool, right? Because I could slot things in. But the problem with a running list is that you're always going to have the same, like, 5 games, probably, that always get the spotlight. So I don't think I want to do that. You know what? Scratch that idea. I think I'm probably just going to. It would be interesting. Maybe I could put out a running list somewhere else. Or, I've got the 5-year channel anniversary coming up in July. That would be an interesting thing to do for the 5-year channel anniversary. I don't know. I need to figure out something for the 5-year channel anniversary. Let me know though also if you guys would like to see like a top 50 or maybe even top 100 games of all time and me talking about each one. I think that would be an interesting thing. If I did that, I would have it as an edited YouTube video, but then I would probably also throw it out in the podcast feed. Unless I do that as a podcast thing, possibly I make a podcast episode around that, and maybe it's like some sort of like a 50th, podcast episode or a 100th podcast. I don't know, but those things are far in the future because we're only on episode 2, so maybe I should slow down. Back to The Last of Us though, because that's what we were supposed to be talking about. The Last of Us Part 1. Yeah, I still have to play Part 2. It's quite amazing. It's not really something that I can like um, talk too much about spoiler free, and it's also not something that I want to talk about spoilers for because I think this is a game that really doesn't hit the same if you have it spoiled for you. Because it really is so focused on the story, and like I said, the mechanics are pretty decent, right? But I think the story is really why you're there for the most part, and I have mixed feelings about that. I don't think I could play just these games. I definitely need my other games, But I think playing one of these games now and then is really a cool thing. And like Spider-Man, right? Spider-Man got a great story. Probably, I think the Last of Us story is probably better, right? It's like it's more interesting. I don't know. I like the Spider-Man story as well, but it's like inherently like a deeper plot, right? But Spider-Man, I think, is mechanically stronger, right? Like this mechanics in Spider-Man are quite good. So I don't know. You could go back and forth. As far as God of War, I think it's somewhere in between. I think the story is probably deeper than Spider-Man, but not as deep as The Last of Us, and the mechanics are probably better than The Last of Us, but not as deep, not as good as Spider-Man. But like I said, I need to play God of War really before I can fully make that judgment. I've like played some of it, but yes, Last of Us. Great game. Like I said, can't really get into any specifics. I will say that this really makes me want to play more of the Naughty Dog games. I guess I played Crash 1, 2, 3. Because I've played those. I played the Insanity trilogy remakes, but I mean they're the same games, right? They're just redone, remastered. So I played those 3 games. Obviously, nothing before Crash Bandicoot of Naughty Dogs is really worth checking out. I guess I could play the Jack and Daxter games. That'd be a fun thing to do at some point. And then Uncharted. I started playing Uncharted, the first game. What is it? Drake's Fortune? Drake's Fortune? I think it's on my desk here. Yeah, Drake's Fortune. I was correct. I usually am. I'm kidding. Anyways, I started playing that, and it just didn't feel well polished, well made on PS3. It just didn't feel like it was rushed out the door, and that's just how most games were on PS3, if I'm being blunt about it. And it's kind of sad, I got a PS3, I'm like, yeah, I got all these, games and stuff I want to play, but I start playing them, I'm like, yeah, this is just not well designed. Like Wii games, I don't have that problem generally. There's definitely some stinkers, right? But I think the Nintendo Wii games are generally fantastic. Mario Galaxy, Skyward Sword, these games are great. Metroid Other M. No, I'm kidding. I haven't played Metroid Other M. I do want to. But anyway. So I think it's yeah. I think it's just kind of really. I think this is how we got to the point where Nintendo was known. Well, Nintendo's always been known for such quality, right? I mean, you had the Nintendo seal of approval, or the seal of quality back on NES, and I think that's was something that was quite important then to consumers. You had the parents going out being like, "All right, this one's got the Nintendo seal on it; it must be good." And I think that was generally a pretty good rule to follow if you weren't like super in on it. And then of course the Nintendo seal continued, and I think that is equally important today. There's definitely things that have maybe you know there's other things that are well made, right? But I think in general, Nintendo has the best track record, and I think that's why myself and some other people that like Nintendo so much get upset about like Pokemon, right? Because Nintendo's not responsible for Pokemon coming out broken, right? They don't make that game, but it definitely hurts their image when the game comes out and it's like broken and it's messed up and it's like you're falling through the floor and it's a mess, right? And I think that really kind of hurts Nintendo's reputation, even though they're not the ones who made it, because it's exclusive on their platform. And I guess it's maybe a little harsh to judge the PlayStation 3 for a Naughty Dog game for the same reason. But to be fair, the Naughty Dog games are made in collaboration with the Sony Interactive Entertainment, whereas I don't think Game Freak like denies all assistance from Nintendo. So I don't know. It's a mess. I wish they could get Monolith Soft on it, right? Anyways, but enough about Pokemon. I'm not a big Pokemon guy. I don't tend to like to talk too much about Pokemon. I've only ever really tried one. It was Shield. I played like an hour. I was like, yeah, it's all right. I mean, it's not horrible. Like it's fine. It just wasn't really quite my thing. So yes, The Last of Us. Like I said, story wise, pretty great. I there were some battles. They were kind of tough. I was like, wow, I'm struggling a little bit. It's probably just because I'm not big on these shootery games. I don't play a ton of them. But I was like, wow, this is and it wasn't like I was frustrated really. I don't think I was ever really all too frustrated. I mean, there were times I was like, oh, come on, but I wasn't very upset about it. In general, I was just kind of like, all right, yeah, I like this challenge. It was a good challenge. And also the story was pretty fantastic, I would say. So. So I think mentioned 13.75 hours plus 2 for Left Behind. So in total, that's 15.75. I'm not yet sure if I'm going to count Last of Us Left Behind and Last of Us Part 1 as two separate games. I'm not yet sure, like at the end of the year. But, I've got, I don't know, 10 months to figure that out. So I think we can, give it a break and worry about it later. As far as other Naughty Dog games, I might go back to Uncharted on PS1, or sorry, not on PS1, on PS3. But I'm kind of thinking of just grabbing the PS4 Nathan Drake collection, and hopefully some of those mechanical polishy, falling through floory issues will have been fixed. And that way I can actually play through all 5 Uncharted games. Because other than falling through floors and weird glitchy stuff and the combat not being super good, I thought The Last of Us was, or not The Last of Us, Uncharted, the little bit I played of it was quite good. It was just those minor things, and also the combat wasn't great, that I didn't like. So, having the context of The Last of Us, and also hopefully having a less broken, and I mean even a nicer looking is always helpful, right? It's not necessary, but it's helpful. Nicer looking version, I think maybe I'll get into it. So hopefully I can play Uncharted at some point, and I can grab The Last of Us Part 2 at some point. I'll probably get the PS5 version. I don't know if I'm assuming that's probably not full price anymore. If it is, I guess I'll just wait because I'm not going to spend full price on that. The Last of Us is not worth $70 to me, but it is a fun game, So, I don't know. Last of Us Part 3, right? I don't know. I'm assuming like that the rumor is that that is actually going to happen, right? I think so. But I know Intergalactic's what they're doing right now. Though I think the Naughty Dog has been on like 2 teams as of recent times, So maybe they're working on The Last of Us Part 3. I know like the first time they split into 2 teams was for Uncharted 3 and The Last of Us. And that's why they were able to get those games out only like what 2 years from each other instead of like the normal 4 or so. And I'm sure now it would take even longer, probably 6 or so. Um, to make those games. So who knows? Maybe they can. And of course, Uncharted 3 was much faster to make, even with half the team size, than the other 2 Uncharted games, because they had already made all the mechanics and stuff. They just had to like, make a new story and a few new areas and stuff. So it was a lot easier. It's a lot easier to make sequels, right, than it is a brand new series in general. I mean, there's definitely exceptions and stuff. So, maybe they've been working on The Last of Us Part 3 in the background this whole time. I guess I wouldn't be, like, too shocked. I know they've, kept The Last of Us Part 1 and 2 both up to date. But, I mean, honestly, that's probably just because they know they'll sell well. I don't know if it actually does confirm that they are working on more of them. I'm not really sure. I'm not really the guy to ask. I don't necessarily know these things. Yeah, these last 6 games, if we want to recap, Kirby 64, great game, 2D platformer. Absolutely, I'd recommend that. And I definitely have some more Kirby's to play. I don't know if I want to play them all, but I wanted to play all the old ones, and I'm kind of getting there. I guess it just depends on what you consider an old one. But I wanted to play all the old ones, plus maybe a couple of the more modern ones, and I'm definitely doing good on that front. Metroid, I've recently, I'm now on my Metroid kick. I played Fusion, I played Zero Mission, and I guess I'm gonna play Super probably fairly soon, to be honest. Get on the Super Metroid. And then we'll see. I don't know. I don't know if I should play Metroid Prime or if I should wait until I can play Metroid Samus Returns and Dread. Maybe I should play those first. I don't know. I'll look into it. I'll think about it. So that's those are on the chopping block. Then we got Final Fantasy 2. I've been kind of alternating um, old turn-based RPGs, and I should clarify old turn-based RPGs because as far as non-turn-based RPGs, I was kind of playing Xenoblade Chronicles, the first one, and then I kind of got stuck on a boss. Well, I don't. I want to spoil it. I got stuck on a boss, and then I also started Yakuza the other day, and I'm only like an hour in, and it's very strange. But it's enjoyable? Question mark probably. I don't know. It's a little strange. And then as far as new turn-based RPGs, I'm playing Persona 3 Reload. So as far as old turn-based RPGs, um, I'm playing like some of the old ones. I have the Final Fantasy series, well, the six of them. I've got the Golden Suns to play. I've got Earthbound to play. I've got the Breath of Fires, the two of them to play. I've got Collection of Mana. I was working on Final Fantasy Adventure was my next one. I was kind of alternating around. I've got Chrono Trigger and I've got Star Ocean First Departure. So I've got a lot of stuff on my plate for that as well. Like I said, lately I've been playing Persona 3 Reload a lot, Yakuza a little bit. I was kind of stuck on Xenoblade Chronicles. I need to go back to Astrobot, you know, need to go back to Final Fantasy Adventure. I have Super Paper Mario that has been outstanding since December, because I wanted to finish up Brothership, and so I kind of left Super Paper Mario in the dust to rot until Christmas, and then I got new stuff, so I kind of got pushed down the list. And then yeah, like I said, I mean, there's stuff I'm gonna get into soon here, probably get back to God of War. Maybe I'll get into Assassin's Creed 2. So there's a lot on the agenda for here soon. But unfortunately, I only had that 1 week off of school. I had school again today as of we're recording this. I started recording this episode on Sunday. I recorded the first, like the intro to it on Sunday. And then I recorded like most of this episode up until I started talking about The Last of Us, like after school on Monday, so probably like probably like 4 o'clock. 4 to like 4:30. I recorded that, and now I'm recording this last 20 minutes or so of it now in the late evening. So yeah, you don't need to know that, but I just thought it was an interesting thing to say. But at this point, I'm just kind of stalling. We're not. This isn't like a super long episode, so I don't need to I'm not worried about it being too long, but it's also not short enough that I want to talk about Switch 2 stuff. So I'm thinking next episode, unless I beat a lot of stuff, I don't think I will. There's a chance I might not beat anything if I'm playing too much Persona. But I'm thinking I'm gonna call it here, and we'll probably talk about Switch 2 stuff tomorrow or next week, unless I beat a lot of stuff. But we've got, what, 5 shows after this until the Switch 2 presentation, which is definitely exciting. So that's exciting. I don't have any Spotify comments. If you want to leave a Spotify comment, obviously you have to be on Spotify. I mean, I guess if you're watching elsewhere, you could go on Spotify and comment, but I'm not sure why you do that. So leave a Spotify comment if you're on Spotify. Any questions? Want to say hi? Anything you want, I'll read it out on the show. You can also do the same in the YouTube comments. I know people have been doing that a little bit here and there. And then there's also the show email, which is or it's not at, sorry, it's not just Nintendo, all one word, NOTJUSTNINTENDO @gmail.com. You can email the show. And also, you can follow the show on both Blue Sky and on X.com or Twitter, whatever you prefer to call it. I was just calling it Twitter up until more recently, so I've finally switched. It's finally switched in my brain, you know. But yes, you can follow over there. Also at Not Just Nintendo, one word, NOTJUSTNINTENDO. And you can follow my personal Blue Sky, which I have not been using as much as I intended to, because I just kind of forgot about it. But you can follow that if you'd like. It's at Ginger Ninja YT, GINJANINJA YT. Ginger Ninja is one word, there's no spaces. So you can follow the show. There's a link for the YouTube Discord server. I don't feel like it's necessary to make a podcast Discord server because, like I said, um, the uh, the communities overlap and stuff, you know, so it's not necessary. I guess if you'd like me to make a podcast Discord server separate, you can let me know. I guess I'll do that if somebody wants me to. Otherwise, the YouTube server is where it's at. And I think that's probably all for today. I think I've plugged everything, right? Probably. I guess if you're, you know, listening on Spotify or that, you can go see my YouTube channel. It is the Ginger Ninja, THE-GINJANINJA. Not dash, sorry, it's a space. Sorry. The space Ginger Ninja. It's got an Animal Crossing City Folk villager as the profile, and I make, you know, gaming videos. Honestly, I need to make more videos. It's been, you know, I've been mostly doing the podcast stuff, so I'll get back in the video grind. Basically, I'll just be working on the podcast throughout the week, and then when I've done with the episode, I'll start working on regular videos and stuff, and that'll just be my schedule moving forward. So, all right. I guess with that said, we can probably call the show here, and we can roll the outro music. See you all for episode 3 next week. 5 weeks until Switch 2, the presentation. So that's gonna be very exciting. I guess I'll see you all next week.